Okay, hopefully I'm in the right right zone here. Yeah, so my name is Jae Silverman. I'm the Massachusetts field agent with Land for Good. I'm also first generation hay farmer in Western Massachusetts, which I'll talk about a little bit. So having leasing be one of my favorite topics to focus on at Land for Good. I'm a real lease nerd and trying to figure out the right sort of leases to fit the right kind of situation. And also being a hay nut and a hay farmer and grass farming in general, I've always been really passionate about responsible, sustainable livestock and grass farming. So having all of this come together is like the perfect Venn diagram for me, and I'm really excited to be here. So thanks for being here also. And certainly, if we have questions as we go, definitely raise your hand. Happy to have it conversational. I'll have my contact information too, and I'd be happy to share the PowerPoint with people. So just feel relaxed and not like you have to scramble and write things down. So yeah, here to talk about leasing specifically as it applies to hay and pasture land with a couple different lenses on it we'll talk about. So just curious by show of hands, who knows of Land for Good or has heard of Land for Good or maybe even worked with us before? Okay, great. So we're a nonprofit. We work in all 6 New England states, and we work on farmland access, tenure, and transfer. So it's really helping people find land in the first place, how to get on that land, both physically but also socially speaking. The tenure piece is how to feel secure on that land and be able to plan and farm on that land. And the transfer piece is who's the next generation, how to get that farmland to stay in farming, oftentimes even finding the next generation, and piecing all that together to try to keep farmland in farming in New England, but we also try to work beyond New England and be involved in national policy and other great organizations around the country. So we do this work by working with kind of 3 main groups of people. People that are currently farming, so maybe they're looking toward succession planning in the future, or they're looking toward expanding their land base, finally getting written leases, that sort of thing. We work with farm seekers, so people that are looking, I just heard some kind of note through the computer. Oh, the computer just said something, but I don't know if that was somebody. That was me. Oh, great. Okay, perfect. I just know if somebody's asking a question through the computer. No, it's all great. So we work with farm seekers, people looking to find land in the first place, expand, relocate, or finally get a written lease in place. And we do a lot of work with non-farming landowners, which is a really important part of the land base in New England, but especially across the country too. Folks that either bought property that came along with a small field, or maybe they bought a farm that hasn't been currently farmed for a while. Maybe they inherited that land or that farm and they're trying to figure out somebody to farm it or keep it in production. So we try to work with all these groups of folks and find the right arrangements and right tools to keep this moving forward. And we do this work through a lot of one-on-one technical assistance. So we work one-on-one with people all throughout the 6 New England states. I cover most of Massachusetts, but we got people in every state to do that. On these things we talked about, and lease crafting is a really big one of those. So I'm really, again, excited to nerd out about that a bit. And then workshops and trainings and advocacy and a lot of online resources that we're always happy to curate for folks and point you in the right direction of what could be helpful. So I come to this as a first generation hay farmer. I've been a hay nut since I was 2 years old for reasons nobody can figure out, except for the bale thrower. That was the thing that clicked something in my brain, and I was that 2-year-old telling everybody about it, and grew up working for a farmer in town who was actually the one who hayed next door to my parents' house. My parents did not coming from a farming background. And I started my own hay operation in 2012. So I'm about to go into my 15th year of it, which is wild. So if we have some time, I'm happy to talk about that in my experience and how that plugs into this as a possible example. But some highlights of that is I operate entirely on leased land. So I don't own any of the farmland. I don't own any of the barns that I use. It's all in my town. And as a first generation townie, I have some of that social capital to fall back on and connections and things like that. But it's been just amazing to kind of scale this up and focus all in the small square bale market and connect with people doing really cool food and fiber stuff with that. And yeah, I'll kind of weave that in. Happy to talk about that too. And but leasing is an incredibly important piece of the hay and grazing land base and trying to figure out those arrangements. And as we'll talk about, free or cheap leasing is often the way that works, especially in New England. And so ways to sort of talk to a landowner about that and figure out the ways it can still be mutually beneficial, even if they're not looking at large dollar signs for a rental amount there. So just curious for a quick show of hands, and if there's anybody who wants to weigh in the chat, feel free to. But just curious who's here in the room today, and you can raise your hands as many times as you want. But who's in kind of the farm seeker or beginning farmer bucket. Okay, great. A lot of you. How about somebody who's a junior generation on an existing farm, or maybe a successor? You don't have to be related, but are you working with a farm? Okay, that's great. Somebody who's actively farming. Do you own a farm business? Okay. And how about people that are currently farming on leased land? Okay, that's really helpful too. Folks that are doing grazing. How about haying? Okay, cool. And feel free to call it out. Anybody else who feel like you fit in the, yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's great. So service provider and yeah, cool. Glad to have you here. Thanks. Cool. Well, really happy to have you all here. Okay. No, just feel free to call it out and interrupt me if somebody's so moved. So really basically, you probably hear the term land tenure thrown around a lot. And when kind of stripped down to basics, for somebody to, or tenure means to hold. So for somebody to have secure or good land tenure, they need to have access to land. They need to have the security to actually hold that land for a certain period of time and have really clear division of responsibility. So know who's responsible for what can and can't happen. So at its most basic, good land tenure needs to have those three things. And that's one of the real important pillars of having a good lease or a good agreement, is knowing those pieces and how that fits in with your business and your land base. So types of leases in general, a big fork in the road is it a verbal lease or a written lease? And there's a lot of verbal leases out there. And I think that percentage goes even higher when it comes to hay and pasture land. I know that's true for me and my business. A lot of them are handshake agreements. Either it's an difficult dynamic to navigate, trying to get something in writing, or you're just maybe haying or grazing a lot of different properties, and trying to manage that many written leases is really difficult. Maybe you want to be able to stay light-footed with yourself and your operation and not sign yourself up for something you're not sure if you're going to want to stick with. But there's a few things that come up with this. One is that there's a saying that a verbal agreement is as good as the paper it's written on. So verbal agreement's great, but as soon as somebody either disagrees or tries to change their mind, or maybe even can't remember what was discussed, which happens all the time, just as human beings, it can really unveil this power dynamic where if it's a verbal agreement, the landowner really has all of the power in the situation. And it's an interesting game to try to unpack that with a landowner, because many are very altruistic. They seem very warm, very friendly, and are. But digging down is, if they have hesitance for written lease, is some of that because they have a fear of giving up a little bit of that power they might have and giving you a legal right to be there for a certain period of time. So it's really a risk analysis for you and your business and any given arrangement. I know for me and my hay operation, but also true for pasturing or any kind of farming operation, if a given agreement is a large percentage of your land base, that might feel like a really risky thing to put on a handshake, because if that changes, a large percentage of your business might change. Versus if a given arrangement is a small piece, maybe it's just an additional hayfield or an additional piece of pasture. And worst case scenario, if that landowner changes their mind mid-season and tells you can't do it, if that doesn't crumple your business, then maybe that feels like an acceptable risk for a handshake lease. But there's a lot of horror stories from people about leases going bad. And a lot of times when you dig deeper, it was a verbal agreement or it was a lease agreement that wasn't written very clearly or didn't have a lot of protections built into it. So our goal is to get leases in writing whenever it's possible and appropriate. And that's something I do a lot of work with people, is how to craft these agreements so they function well in the real world. There's a few different subcategories of it. You can have short-term leases that are either trying out a piece of property, maybe are year to year. You can have really clever things like rolling term leases, where every year one more year is added to it. And so you have a planning horizon that keeps moving with you, which I'll share an example of that. And then there's other long-term leases where people have access to a piece of property for 10 or 20 or more years. Sometimes there's a lease to own component where there's an option to buy that land at some point in the future. And then, of course, there's other types of leases as well: equipment leases, building leases, livestock, infrastructure, other ways to sort of work that into an arrangement. And it's a real grab bag. Leases can be really creative, and it just depends what you need and sort of how you can present it to a landowner without, making their eyes go wide and feel like they don't know how to approach the situation, which can also happen. And just a quick FYI, but this also it applies to handshake leases too. There's a big difference between a lease versus a license or a permit. And so a written lease, a true written lease, gives you as the farmer extensive temporary legal interest in the land. So it's for a specific period of time. And if it's set up correctly, you know what you can and can't do there for a very specific period of time, and you can plan accordingly. Whereas a license agreement, also known as a permit, and for this conversation, it also applies to handshakes, are really just permission to use the land. A lot simpler, but are generally revocable at any time. So a written license or a written permit often comes up with town-owned land or state-owned land, public land, where they legally can't give someone that legal interest in it via a lease agreement. It's still in writing, but it's important to know that it actually is just permission and could be changed at will of the landowner. So public land is a really important piece of land base. I hay a town-owned field. It works out really well, but it's something I have to have in the back of my mind that even though we have it in writing for a 3-year period, they technically could change their mind at any moment. And then it becomes kind of a public relations thing for the owner of it, of, if it's a town or an organization, they don't want to have a reputation of changing that on a farmer mid-season. But with a private landowner, maybe you want to be a little bit more cautious. If they say, no, I just want to do a permit, or let's just keep it on a handshake. And there's this kind of graphic or this notion about bundle of rights or bundle of sticks. They call it sometimes, that come with a specific piece of property, that there's rights to do all kinds of different things on that property. And kind of this, I guess the cursor's not showing up. What's circled sort of shows with a leasehold interest, the farmer actually has one of those legal rights for a specific period of time to farm that land and do what's outlined in the lease, versus other arrangements like a handshake or a license or a permit technically don't have those legal rights that they're holding for that period of time. So hearing from you guys, when it comes to leasing hay and pasture land, what are some advantages that come to mind about leasing it versus owning or other types? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Bar as far as like monetary or, okay, yeah, yep. Anybody else? Yeah.
I mean, sometimes depending on where you are, especially taxes being so high, but not sometimes rent can actually be a little bit more than taxes.
Right. Okay. So the idea of rental rate compared to taxes and doing some of those calculations. Yeah.
Your like farm goals are changing.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So yeah, if you're not, whether your goals are your farm or just you're expanding or relocating or trying to figure out your land base or your scale, having that flexibility, absolutely. Anybody else? It's okay if not. I know it's the last session of the day too. Yeah, but no, you guys are really hitting on a lot of this idea of some flexibility and scalability. I know for myself, I started out haying 9 acres, and I think last year I did about 60. And so just trying to make that decision from the get-go about buying land versus having kind of this ability to change it. And yeah, this idea of profitability, especially in grass farming, where revenue per acre tends to be a lot lower than other types of farming. Is owning land ever really going to pencil out for you and your business? I'm not saying that's a hard yes or a hard no, but it's definitely numbers to be crunching on this. I sort of highlighted maybe the ones most applicable for this conversation, but other uses of your money when you're starting out or expanding your business, trying to figure out your debt plan or ratio, the overhead cost piece, and what do you have to pay on a yearly basis, and especially if you're dealing with free or cheap hay and pasture land, that can make a big difference compared to owning it. And then, there's also this management transfer piece that I think pops up, especially with hay and pasture land, maybe even a little bit more frequently than other types of farming, where somebody is changing their business dynamic. There's a lot of retiring farmers in the grass farming world, especially in the hay world, but I think, across dairy and everything else. And I think it happens really frequently that you have given hay fields or given piece of pasture land that somebody pulls back from and suddenly it's available. And that might be easier to tap into than trying to access land for sale and build something up that way. And something I'll talk about a little if I have time, but one thing I've run into as I call myself a traveling circus hay farmer, because all of my fields are spread out. I have a map I'll show later. And it can feel like this high logistical cost of moving your stuff around that much. And especially if you're doing livestock, I know that compounds even more, because I always joke, at least my hay equipment isn't going to run off on me in the middle of the night, hopefully. But especially in these diverse years we keep having in New England and beyond of rainfall amounts and everything like that, I found myself in this unique, light-footed, advantageous spot in wet years that I've got a diverse portfolio of land and soil types, even rainfall amounts within the same town, where I could keep hopping around to different fields versus other farmers I knew where they were paying the family farm and everything was too wet and they couldn't do a darn thing. So trying to find some of those little bits of advantage, even if you find yourself with a lot of logistical costs. All right, so I just talked a lot on that, but how about disadvantages? Same question, but flipped around for, yeah, leasing, hay, or pasture land. Anything come to mind? Yeah.
It's just kind of the classic like land rich cash poor kind of thing, where it really is the like income and cash and all that. It works with wealth.
Yeah.
The wealth that you grow as a farmer.
Right. So sort of perpetuating that dynamic of who owns the land, and if you continue leasing it, that ownership doesn't necessarily change hands. Yeah, that's absolutely a big one. Anybody else? Yeah.
I guess related to that is it can go away at any point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So not knowing how long you'll be having access to that land. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a big one. Yep. Right. So if it's more complex, anything from putting up fencing, wells, or shelter, or other kinds of improvements, yeah, just will you know that you can be there long enough to get the value out of it, or if something changes, how would that work out? So that's a huge one. Yeah.
Kind of along the same lines, but transitioning land to organic.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, how we manage that.
Sure. So different either stewardship requirements or farming practices like organic, and knowing the history of the land, or knowing there might at least be a period of time that you've got to put it through a transition period. And if your land base keeps changing, that can be really challenging. Definitely. Yeah.
I guess in Vermont, it's relevant that there's a lot of conflict on who gets the state payment for certain practices on the land.
Oh yeah. Right. So yeah. So payments for practices, or even sometimes grants for improvements, or how all that works. If there's multiple stakeholders between the landowner and the farmer, that can be difficult to navigate. Yeah. Yeah, right. So yeah, family dynamics being a big piece of that, and including who's going to lease or use a piece of land next. It's not always about the ownership; it's about the farming piece of it too. Yeah, I saw one more. Okay. Sure. Yeah. So relationship building and yeah, putting that time in with the owner, that makes a lot of sense. This is great. Anything else, sir? Feel free, but.
I was gonna say it's all in lines.
Yeah.
Kind of incidental.
Yep. Somebody else's opinion involved. Yeah.
And it's just hard to have, just like you said, like just multiple different sections, especially when you're haying, of land, sometimes like across multiple towns.
Yep.
You know, it gets frustrating, and like moving bales all the time, and yeah, that can just take a lot of time.
Yeah. It's just the logistical costs of all of it. I know. Come August, I find myself dreaming of just one large contiguous set of hay fields, but yeah, no, you guys are really naming it. You know, it's the security piece. Are you needing to find yourself planning year to year and constantly rechecking in with landowners? And, you know, this is the time of year for spreadsheet farming for a lot of us. And do you even know that plan yet? And you have to keep running scenarios until you hear back on things. The investment in improvements piece is huge. Fencing for livestock is, when I'm working with livestock farmers trying to find land, that is one of the biggest barriers. And what exists, what's possible, what are the risks involved of animals getting out? Are the landowners even aware of what livestock farming is like? There's so many factors that go into it. And so trying to have a lease that's set up to take those factors into account and figure out enough security for you to feel like you can be there long enough to get a return on those investments, or even other creative ways. Maybe a landowner actually wants to invest in that because they want to see the farming happen there, or there's so many different ways that can be navigated. But also fertility is a huge one of them. And I think especially with hay, but also certainly to get pasture back, into production, especially when it hasn't been productive pasture land for a while, is spending a lot of time on fertility and lime and ways to get land back into shape. If you don't have secure land tenure there and you don't know how long you're going to be there, that's also really difficult. And I find myself, even as a huge soil nerd and always trying to do right by the fields and putting fertility down and replenishing what I take off, if a field is really unknown and I don't know whether I'm going to have it next year, it's hard to invest, in that level of fertility. And I find myself on some pieces putting down urea a given year because I just want that nitrogen boost, but I'm not willing to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars for the long term if I don't know if I can be there next year. And that gets difficult year to year. So yeah, this is great. You guys are really, really nailing it with the right audience. So a lease itself, leases can feel very intimidating sometimes, especially when you don't know much about them or what goes into them. Landowners especially can feel touchy about it or feel like too much of a contract. So part of this, I wanted to talk about leases a bit in general, and especially how that applies to hay and pasture land, and try to debunk some of that and show how creative leases can truly be. So the minimum to put in a lease are these 5 aspects. You've got who's involved, so who's the landowner, who's the tenant, defining where the premises is, hopefully more than an address, either a description or some maps or something to really show the boundaries of it. When does the lease start and end, being the term. Consideration is what's being exchanged, either monetarily or otherwise, which we'll talk about, and the signatures of the folks. And so those 5 things are basically the most simple bare bone lease you can have. And they sometimes fit the circumstance, especially for a hayfield or something else. Sometimes that can be all you need, but can still give you that legal security to be there for a certain period of time. But hearing from the rest of you guys, what else can you think of that could be in a lease, in general or specific to hay and pasture land? And what are some considerations that you'd like to see covered?
Like outside of those.
Yeah, outside of those 5, like what are additional things you'd like to see? Yeah, improvements, right? So what can and can't happen, and how are they dealt with, either at the end of the lease or over time? Sure. It's okay. Again, I know it's the last session of the day, but yeah, sure. So, yep, who gets access to that land? In terms of, like, if there's multiple people that are interested, or if, sure. Yep. Yeah. Multiple uses, recreation, or even the landowner themselves, what can and can't be done when. Absolutely. I had a well-meaning landowner that I started haying their field. I took first cut, and they mowed second cut with their lawn tractor because they didn't know I was coming back yet. Or they didn't know I was coming back at all. They just didn't understand. Never even occurred to me to clarify it. And thankfully, it was a small field and a learning moment. But best intentions, you still get surprised by just what people don't realize. So that's a good example. Okay, well, feel free to chime in. But yeah, this idea of what can and can't you do, and to that note, what can and can't the landowner do? I had another circumstance on a wet field where I communicated with the landowner. It was a super wet year. And I said, hey, I hayed where I could. It was way too wet in these other spots. He went out there the next week with his brush hog, and brush hog perpendicular to the way that I hay it, and made the biggest ruts I've ever seen. And to this day, still can't hay those sections of those fields. Best intentions, sweet landowner, didn't understand or realize. And now some of the ground's really not usable for hay. So just having it simply in the lease about, hey, we just need mutual agreement if you're going to go out there and brush hog part of the hay field. Likewise, things that I need your permission for to go do, can really just clarify a lot of it. If infrastructure is involved, or and fencing very much part of that conversation, what's the maintenance and repairs plan? Or if you're using part of a barn, hay barn, using it for livestock shelter, having some kind of flow chart for who's responsible for what before it happens, rather than having some kind of major repair or ongoing maintenance that's needed and it's not actually clear. Maybe the landowner thinks you're going to do it, maybe you think they're going to do it, and it's a lot. Even if it can feel difficult to clarify when you're writing the lease, it's a lot easier than when something's actually popped up and suddenly real money's at stake, real time, all of that. So there's some examples there, and I've seen it go in any number of ways, and sometimes that feeds back into the rental rate, where if the landowner is responsible for everything, that could be a reason to charge more rent, and vice versa. Just doing my own time check here. Okay, good. Let's see. Oh, and the renewal piece. Yeah, just what happens for a renewal process? How often can that happen? Same thing with termination and default. When the lease ends, not only what are the very specific reasons why it can end early, but even if it ends at the end of the lease term, what happens for fencing or getting hay out of the barn or anything like that? Just having a protocol so everybody understands from the beginning what's going to happen at the end can be really important. Dispute resolution is one that actually people don't talk about a lot, but is a really easy thing to build into leases, especially in New England, where we have really good ag mediation programs. And I think every state, if I'm right. But I know that exists in other parts of the country too. Actually, I meant to say at the beginning, just show of hands. Is anybody here farming outside of New England, or is this a New England crowd? Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, we're happy to have you as neighbors. Like a transition state. But yeah, just, I definitely want to make my caveat that my experience is in New England, and, not wanting to speak too broadly, because I know that hay and pasture in other parts of the country are, definitely different. But just having something that nudges people in the direction of having ag mediation support if there's breakdown in communication before something really devolves in the lease. And then, yeah, stewardship considerations, whether that's you yourself as the farmer wanting to make sure the landowner doesn't apply non-organic substances to the hayfield or pasture, or vice versa. There are definitely landowners that are really particular about organic stuff. Comes up a lot, but there's other other criteria that could be really important to have spelled out in the lease. Yeah, and the idea of access to it, who has access to it, customers coming, all of those pieces, just really making sure that dovetails with the landowner and their expectations, and try to get in front of some of that friction that might pop up. So this isn't meant to be read. This is an example of a 2-pager we have on our website that I'm always happy to point people toward. It's called Elements of a Good Farm Lease, and it's a great place to start if you're trying to craft a lease agreement. It's definitely a few steps before diving into a legal language draft, just trying to get some ideas down on paper and all the different things that might go in a lease that we just talked about, some explanations on it, and a way to get an outline starting to be built to then talk to the other party or landowner or anybody else who might be involved. So our website has a lot of resources on it, and that's one that I point to a lot as a good starting point. So determining the rent comes up a lot in leases in general, and can definitely be a sticky wicket when it comes to hay and pasture leases, especially in New England. And again, this is where I think it shifts a lot throughout the country, and also gets into what kind of crops are we talking about. I mean, in New England, the vast majority is grass and grass mixes. Alfalfa becomes a very different game in other parts of the country, and has more competitive land and that sort of thing. But in general, but especially in New England, a starting point is what is comparable land going for. And so what we tend to see in New England, and with our Land for Good hats on, we're always trying to get a sense of how these rental rates are changing and shifting over time. But what is comparable land going for? And really, truly in New England, with some exceptions, it tends to be very free or very cheap for pasture and hayland. Vast majority is in fact free use, maybe something like $30 or $35 an acre per year, depending. In these scenarios, which this comes up a lot when I'm talking with landowners, that in that scenario, usually the fertility, lime, and even fencing money is on the tenant. So it's not a landowner also providing all of those things. But those situations exist too, and it's really this gradient of what does the landowner need, how hard is it for them to find someone to farm it, and then you as a farmer, what pencils out for you and feels worth it, and how long of a lease is it? Just for reference, for other types of farming, again, in New England, we tend to see like $50 to $150 an acre per year for tillable land, maybe upwards of $300 or even more than that in some of the most prime soil. I said Western Mass for me. I'm in Conway, Mass, which is really close to Shelburne Falls, if anybody knows that corner of the state, or 20 minutes from Greenfield. I am one town just out of the Connecticut River Valley. I've got rocks and trees and hills and not much prime farmland. Just one town down into the valley from me is some of the best farmland in the country, if not the world, and it's incredibly competitive. And so trying to hay or pasture that land can be a very different game than trying to, 500 an acre or even more, and competitive not just with other types of farming, but development and all of this stuff. So again, this is all very much in context to your hyper-local situation and variables, and really competition and soil type, but really is a factor of that competition, are one of the biggest drivers up and down in this kind of gradient of rental rates. But just kind of a ballpark starting point. And that's not including infrastructure. That's really just talking about raw land. Fencing, I think existing fencing could go either side of that equation. But if you're renting a barn or renting storage space, that varies so wildly, we don't even really have good like baseline rental rates for it. Yeah.
I just have a question.
Sure.
I get a lot of questions about there's confusion over like contract grazing.
Mm-hmm.
Like if some farmers will argue that the landowners
Yeah.
to graze, which I think
No, that's a really good. Right. No, that's a great point. So this idea of contract grazing and almost running the rental rate into the negative, where it's going the other direction, and the landowner is paying the farmer. And I'd say that's absolutely part of this like competition scale gradient, where and it might even be trending that way in a lot of the towns. I know in my town, there's more hayland available than I can get to. Farmers keep retiring, keep trying to kick fields my way, and I'm like desperately trying to slow time down and get to all of it. And so not that I'm at the point for asking landowners to pay me to do it, but gosh, I see things trending that direction at a certain point. And that can be a really difficult conversation to have too. I know it comes up in dual use solar a lot. So like people trying to graze solar fields and saying, hey, this is a service, like a lot of work going in to get my animals there. And there can be a little bit of a mismatch of expectations. But yeah, so I think that's definitely part of this. And what can each party afford for it? Yeah.
Actually, kind of had a question for you. Is there, like in Vermont, does anyone keep track of average land rent across 50 counties?
Not that I'm aware of. I'd love that.
Someone should do that.
Maybe land for good. I haven't really looked for it.
Yeah, Mike Gia is our Vermont field agent. He's just a whiz with, so much. And so I don't know if he has much of that written down, but he's part of like our team always trying to compare notes on this. And how does that shake out? So the piece I wanted to say about infrastructure, this comes up for me with hay barns a lot, but also for shelter or storage or things like that. The opportunity cost for the landowner, I'd say, is the biggest factor in rental rate. And by that, I mean, what would they be doing with that barn or piece of infrastructure if you weren't using it? If it would just be sitting there empty, they'll probably offer it for free or cheap. And I know for me in my traveling circus, sometimes I would not be interested in haying a field if there wasn't a barn right there that I could use. But if they themselves are using it for a lot of things, or they could rent it out for storage space, or they might really be crunching the numbers and saying, look at, I need to get X amount of dollars for your use of it in order for it to be worth it for me because I could use it for something else. So I'd say that's one of the biggest things to be paying attention to if there's infrastructure involved in a hay or pasture lease. And communication with the landowner about that. So determining the rent in general is this Venn diagram of what does the landowner need, what can the farmer afford, and is there true overlap there? And in my experience doing this with Land for Good and helping people negotiate, if either party's stepping far outside of their means or their needs, it often isn't a good sign of a long-term fit. So as a farmer, you might feel like this property and this either whole farm or field is too good of an opportunity to pass up. But if you think about year after year, if you're paying a lot more than you think it's either worth or than you can afford, it might not be the best long-term fit. And that's okay. You might decide you want to do it for a short period of time, try it out, get to know the landowner. It's all part of your, business calculation to be doing. But this gets to what somebody else brought up too, is what other benefits are you providing for that landowner, either in addition to or more commonly in lieu of monetary rent? So opening it back up to you guys, whether you're haying or pasturing, and you can definitely specify if you've got one in mind, but other than paying rent, what other benefits would you be providing to a landowner? What are things you can either talk about or put in the lease?
A lot of these small fields like me, people are paying somebody to brush on.
Yep.
So
That's a
go in and get the field for free, and then a lot of guys in our area are getting the landowner to pay for the inputs, the line,
yeah.
and all that stuff.
That's a great so. Right, because if their alternative, like you said, is paying a few $100s or more for somebody to brush hog it, and that comes up more and more as hay and grass farmers are retiring. And again, depending on where you are, because I know there's certain towns and certain pockets where it's still in fierce competition for hay and pasture land. Other places like my town where it just keeps opening up and everybody's turning to me as the whippersnapper out there. So which is a fun challenge, but it's a little stressful. But yeah, that's a huge piece of it. So providing that maintenance benefit, the mowing piece, and then and like you said, that's the idea of the landowner paying for maybe fertility and input costs is just, again, part of that rental rate calculation when you kind of strip it down to its base. Are they willing to sweeten the deal to have the farmer there? Yeah. Yep.
Lease agreements, and each landowner has like a different vision and purpose. So like some of them want just like have the property farm with like some cows out there and like, to see that it's not one waste.
Yeah.
And then also sometimes like have them feed or something else like in addition to putting on demand, but
Yep.
some type of product.
Yeah, so the idea of like an in-kind consideration that's being provided for them that's not monetary but still has a monetary value to it, which you could do that with mowing in lieu of brush hogging too. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yep.
I manage a solar grazing company.
Oh wow.
So for us, it's really about other than the like actual vegetation management, it's a lot of fertility additions through manure of sheep, great like visuals for the solar companies.
Yeah.
But that like providing fertility, like continued fertility for that land, if it's not in current use.
Yeah.
That's another thing, is keeping that land in current use.
Right. Okay. So I'm hearing three important threads there. One is fertility and soil building. Another is like the aesthetics and management of the place. But another big one is tax benefits for the landowner. Current use programs of the given state. I won't use state-specific jargon here, but somebody farming their land, and that means they pay drastically less real estate taxes, at least on that portion. That's a big one. This is great. So no, you guys are, again, really hitting this. It's the management piece. So mowing, fertility, and again, clarifying what's expected and who pays for it can be a big one. The aesthetic piece, the environmental piece, current use part for taxes. So that one can be like rent. I mean, really, when they crunch the numbers, if it's not in current use and you farming it allows it to be in current use and you're not paying them cash rent, they still might be effectively getting cash rent from it. Or maybe somebody stopped farming it and they want to keep it that way, and you coming in to farm it is a way to keep it in current use taxes. That can be a big benefit. In Massachusetts, we currently have a 5-acre minimum on current use, and that makes it really difficult. And thankfully, I have a lot of landowners that see all these other benefits, but I think there's only like 3 properties that I hay out of the 60 acres that are over that 5-acre minimum. Everything else is piecing together these smaller pieces, and they're squeezed out of getting that current use tax. So it really depends on the state-specific program. Yeah, are they getting hay or food or some other kind of in-kind product or rent is a big piece on this. And be mindful of the monetary implications of that for your business and trying to have everybody be on the same page. It's in any lease negotiation, one of the biggest things I'm trying to avoid is where both sides think they're doing the other one a favor. Landowner can think they're being really generous and providing all of this stuff and not asking for anything in return, but they're getting hay out of it, they're getting beef out of it, or part of a CSA share or something else. And as the farmer, you're looking at what you're providing for them as a service for fertility, all of this other stuff. And if that's not at least communicated, whether it's written in the lease or talked about, can be really easy for resentment to start building and both sides to start griping about it. So yeah, being mindful of that piece. And if beef or hay, that comes up a lot too, is provided, I think it's worth putting in the lease as an in-kind consideration, so everybody understands what's happening. There could be tax implications for the landowner if they're getting $1,000 worth of hay. That's technically rent that they're receiving and should be reporting. So it's not quite as simple as that. But making sure everybody understands the value of what's happening. And there's a lot of landowners I've talked to that they say, oh, it's free lease, but then you dig down and they're getting 1,000 bales of nice hay out of the deal. And they're frustrated that no other farmer is willing to just do that. And it's like, well, you might have had a pretty sweet deal with who you had do it before. So it really all depends. And then, yeah, there's other kind of altruistic goals. Supporting local agriculture is a big theme. Supporting regenerative farming and ethical livestock, really resonates with folks. And, looking toward the future of the land and trying to make sure that a field that's been farmed for a long time continues to be farmed, because we all know how quickly hay and pasture land is lost to invasives and everything else when it's not managed. So this is great. I appreciate you guys really sinking your teeth into this. So when it comes to actually negotiating a lease, talked about it a bit, I think some of my biggest advice is to talk about specifics ahead of time and try to get some of those sticky issues figured out and come to some pre-agreement on how you determine that. The idea of a rough draft, plain language outline to negotiate off of is a really helpful tool. Trying to have a legally worded document that then you plunk down and are trying to make changes to is just a really frustrating way to make everybody's eyes glaze over. But trying to keep it simple, keep it in plain language, and get it all for negotiation purposes, and then formalize it into a written, or formalize it into a legal lease agreement. That ideally both parties should have an attorney review, but it all comes down to what people's timelines and comfort level are. But all of this are things that we help with at Land for Good, and really try to help either one party or even both parties structure an agreement that works well in the real world and then can be formalized into a written lease. Great, just doing a time check. Are we going until 4? Okay, great. Because I want to make sure there's also time for Q&A. Any burning questions before I go on? Or okay, well, feel free to raise your hand if that's helpful. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my experience, being a traveling circus hay farmer, and my kind of land tenure and how that may or may not apply to different people's operations. And again, fully recognizing that piecing together a lot of hayland parcels can be a very different game than doing that with livestock. But as I mentioned, I farm entirely on leased acreage. It's all free lease, or the ones that are written down, we work in sort of an in-kind. Sometimes it's $1 worth of in-kind, contribution for the mowing and stuff, just to make sure that there is a monetary amount in there, because if not, it's not actually considered a lease. But again, that can be in-kind. And yeah, like I said, I started out doing 9 acres with small, I'm got a bunch of Massey Fergusons, but I started with just a little one and built it up over time. And as farmers were sort of pulling back from it, picking up more fields, trying to bring fields back into production that hadn't been in quite a while, and being in this sort of New England hill town climate, it's all grass, mixed hay, but I think of all the fields, most probably haven't seen a plow in 50 plus years. And so it's just trying to really manage the fertility, play the game with different grass types, and improve the quality of what's there. But part of that is cultivating these arrangements with landowners, whether it's in writing or just a good, solid handshake lease, which could sound like an oxymoron, but again, it depends what kind of social capital you have and build that rapport with people. To be working on improving other people's land to benefit my business. Yeah, I saw your question.
No, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
About you mentioning it has to have voluntary.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that Massachusetts specific?
That's a really good question. I don't want to say without shadow of a doubt that it's not, but my understanding is that generally, if not across the board, for a lease to legally be considered a lease, it has to have something named for a consideration. But again, it could be in kind. So the idea of saying like, oh, the management of the hayfield and mowing twice a year and all of that as part of hay production is worth $1, and naming that in the lease, I believe, should be good enough. But that's again why having an attorney, and especially a state-specific attorney, with is helpful to have them run over that. So yeah, but just spinning my own yarn a little bit. My business model would never support owning the land base that I'm trying to farm. I feel lucky that I've turned haying into part of my livelihood, have it be profitable at the scale that it's at. But trying to buy the land that I'm farming just would never pencil out. It would have to be some sort of other investment with some other money source or something like that to treat the land itself as an investment, and then the ability to farm it as like kind of a bonus to it. So gosh, it's one of those things. I talk about my farm so much that I'm probably skipping over a lot, but I just thought oh boy, this is going to show up very well. But my acreage base is really spread out amongst town. In fact, the main barn that I use, I realize, is off the screenshot, way up a hill, and so it's playing this traveling circus game across 20 something different fields and probably 15 different landowners, and it can be a lot of time moving stuff and a lot of check-ins and relationships to maintain and a lot of communication with landowners. But it spreads my risk out quite a bit, both in terms of if a landowner or a situation changes, if somebody sells their property, generally doesn't affect my business too much if a given field comes in or out of rotation. And like I talked about with severe weather, it's wild how much of a benefit it's been to be able to refocus on other areas. I know that, we keep going between dry and wet years, but it's 2023. My town, Conway, in July had more rainfall than anywhere else in the entire US and Canada combined. Not combined, just anywhere else in either of those two, like any other town. And people were completely shut down, and I was able to pick up the circus and start second cut on dry fields, even though I still had a third of first cut left to do. And then trying to explain that year to people was like a haying version of who's on first, because I had some second that was earlier than first. That meant I did some third cut that was earlier than second. And at that point, is that later second, technically third? It was just like, it was wild. I almost had a bale that was half first and half third cut. I would have like framed it or something. But having that flexibility, despite all of the frustrations and the logistical stuff we talked about, could be an advantage to this. And same thing for livestock farming, which again, I know can be a lot more to juggle for parsing together different pieces of acreage. But that also comes down to what type of fencing is there, what type of livestock do you have? Sometimes people have more luck doing that with sheep and electronet than trying to keep bovines in. But yeah, there can just be different creative ways to go about it. Yeah. Per bale. I should have the per bale cost figured out. That's a really good question. I think my rough math is that on a given year, oh boy, this is where I'm getting really broad. On a given year, I'm able to make about half. What am I trying to say? I think of all the revenue that I make from hay, I'm able to maintain about a third to half of that as cost. So I'm able to, that's not including paying myself on top of stuff. So I'd have to figure that out per bale because it gets a lot worse with second cut than first cut. That's a really good question. I should crunch that number. I do know that when something becomes mulch, it's just about a wash. is the way that I've crunched that. Because there's been years where I've been so delayed on first cut. I'm thinking, should I just keep mowing it to purposefully make mulch just to get the hay off the field to get second cut to grow back? And in crunching those numbers for me and my situation, the answer is no. as much as those years I'm dying to mow whatever I can and start risking stuff. But yeah, it can certainly be challenging. And again, I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, I'm doing all small squares, which honestly, they should just be called squares. The other one should be called big squares. But anyway, yeah, so it's definitely different market if you're trying to sell hay or trying to sell round bales, and then absolutely if you're making them for yourself. There's a whole kind of continuum of round versus squares and handling and all of that stuff. So I don't want to belabor my own situation too much, but there's probably other pieces of it that I meant to mention, but that serves me right for not making bullet points on that. So I thought I would maybe show you a quick example of one of the hay leases that I have in case that's helpful. So this property here, actually I'll back up, is that field there. It's by far the biggest contiguous piece of acreage that I've ever picked up last year. It's about 15 acres or so. It's a very, very hilly field, but has really fine grass and is beautiful. And the folks that were previously haying it pulled back. It was actually somebody from a different town that was coming all the way up and making wraparound bales there. And the owner has it up for sale and was trying to get somebody lined up to continue haying it. She and her family had hayed it for years before that, understood the whole game, the management benefit, even had a real estate agent who was saying, do you have a hay person lined up yet? So that rarely happens for real estate agents to understand that part of the process. So when I came in, saying, okay, this is a big jump up, but I have a few pieces of criteria that I really need to make this work for me. One is use of that barn to store some hay, as well as utilize this lean-to area to park full wagons in, because for me, my bottleneck is always how much hay can I get undercover in some way on a baling day. But then also have, sorry, I guess I didn't outline this in my criteria, but to have some kind of security and know how long could I be there for. I was talking with her in late May about this, and when I agreed to pick it up, and she said, oh, I'm sure even if it sells, you'll be able to come back and take second cut. And I said, that's great. What I'm worried about is January, February, and not knowing yet. And I'm making my plan for the next year. I need to know, am I going to have access to this field or not? And she thankfully really heard that. And so what we set up is, at least for right now, a 1-year lease that runs January through December. The first one started in June, but and then if I haven't heard anything come December 31st, it auto renews for another year, and it transfers with ownership. So the idea of whoever buys the place, I come with it at least for that season. And it's this way of not having to be yanked out from under me mid-season and know I have that kind of planning horizon. And explaining that reasoning to her, she understood and she went for it. She very easily could not have. She might have said, that might really affect my ability to sell this. I don't want to do that. But it was a conversation, and really thankfully, she was up for that. And so that's what we have in place. The property is actually supposed to sell this winter. She has a buyer lined up. And so even though the lease renewed, I'm going to still have that conversation with the new owner, because if they truly don't want me there, it's not going to help me to cling on to it for one season and then, be without it. But point being is there can just be these creative little bits that you can put in a lease to make that clarity and have that planning horizon for what you need. In the long run, if I get along with the new landowners, I would love this to be like a 3-year rolling lease, where at any point in time, I know I've got 3 years planning horizon. That means I can put lime down and, can play the acreage shuffle game a little bit more. But this felt like a risky one to jump on, but also too good of an opportunity to pass up. So that's sort of one example. Yeah, okay. And then at termination, I have 60 days to remove hay from the barn. That's in it. That felt like a really important one to talk about, especially with a sale involved. And also making sure, especially with some of my other experience, that there's a feedback loop. If the landowner wants to mow, graze, remove my rock markers, of which there are many, or start applying substances in the hayfield, that needed mutual consent. And in my mind, it was less about the current owner and more about the future unknown owner, that, if the place sold midsummer or something like that, and they came in and yanked out all my rock markers, that could be an expensive discovery with the mower. So just trying to play that game of what did I need to know and for what period of time. And again, cognizant of time, but just a quick license example I thought I'd mention. So again, a license or a permit being different than a lease, it's still in writing, but it's just permission to be there, but it's not absolute, like it can be revoked. So again, this is a town-owned piece of land that I've got a 3-year license with them for use. And it's funny, the town's approaching it as though it is a lease. At no point has anybody in the select board or anything else mentioned like, oh, but it is a license, we could change our mind. And I'm not inclined to educate them on that. But I am ready for it to change. And, it's a really nice field. It's flat. It's well drained. I took second cut on this after 8 inches of rain the previous day. It was wild. People are out there cleaning up from flood damage, and I was out there mowing. That was one of my pivots mid first cut. but again, being town-owned land, they can't give me legal interest in it because that's a conflict of interest issue on public land. So I have the license, but I know what it means, and I'm not overly putting eggs in this basket. One other tidbit that I think is fun to mention on this one, and after a couple of years of doing it, it's all orchard grass. This is the only field I do that's been plowed in the last 10 years. And another farmer volunteered to do it. It was great. They planted pure orchard grass, and as an entirely dry hay farmer, customers hate the first cut. It's just like trying to catch it in that sweet spot is really difficult. So what I approached the town about and built into the license is that I can collaborate with other hay farmers. We have one main dairy still left in town. And so now they chop first cut in May, and I come in for second and third cut. And it ends up being this really nice collaboration. The town was all for it. They actually liked the idea that multiple farmers were sharing management of the field. But it means more legwork on my part, making sure that dairy farm's actually submitting the paperwork they need to for the town. And then, of course, there's a walking path, and it's, there's a lot of public interaction there. Some people call it the dog park because of added fertility, but it tends to work really well and has enough beneficial pieces to it that, that I'm going with it. But if it was a much bigger piece of my operation, I think I'd have a lot more pause on it, because even the town mentioned that having me farm it was a way to keep, I wish I knew all the zoning regulations and what exactly they were saying, but it allowed the town more future options of what to do with the land if it was going to stay in agriculture versus if nobody was haying it. There's possible senior housing they've talked about, even though I don't think it's going to happen. Townwide septic for the center of town, things like that. That the landowner, at least they were transparent with me, that the town had motivations beyond just the management and aesthetics to keep it in hay, but all things I have to have in my mind and have a 3-year license. But if something passes at town meeting and they're going to change the use of it, I've got to be ready for that to happen. I think I just saw, yeah.
I'm curious, for your business, like, do you have specific buyers? What quality are you looking for?
Oh, yeah. Right. No, that's a great question. Okay, I'll circle right back that I want to make sure I'm not missing but I'm happy to answer that question. Okay, cool. Quick tools I wanted to share. I'm not going to talk much about, but we have some tutorials on our website about calculating acreage using Google My Maps. If you haven't done it, highly recommend it. It's on the Google suite, and you can make color coding. You can hide and show layers. It's how I made that big farm map of all my hay fields. And we've got a two-page tutorial on doing that. It can be really helpful for leases to make sure everybody understands the boundaries and having maps that way. I won't get into soils right now, but we have soils mapping tools. But this informs rental rate, also informs what's a new piece of acreage like, especially if you're walking a field in a dry year and you don't know whether it's underwater or anything like that in a wet year. This can be helpful. So we've got a 2-page tutorial on how to use the UC Davis tool. Okay, great. Yeah, and I'm pretty much at the end. So we offer up to 2 hours of no-cost help one-on-one with people in New England states. Oftentimes there's grants and stuff we can tap into to extend that. So not viewing that as a strict constraint, it's just where we start. And lots of resources on our website. It can be a lot to wade into. And that's where us field agents, we're always happy to talk with you and help guide you towards certain resources. Okay, cool. So I'll answer that question and then open up for anybody else. So you're saying specific, do I have specific buyers for the hay that I make? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So I do. I feel really lucky to have a very dedicated repeat customer base, and I know this varies all across the state and region. But for a lot of New England, and luckily true where I am, small squares are at a production deficit for New England. So somebody's stuck with the short straw of buying it in from New York. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, but specifically like Pennsylvania, Canada, like buying it in from afar. And so in my experience with good communication and being transparent about practices, decent or good quality squares tend to sell themselves is what I've found. And I know that's not a fair thing to say because there's lots of people that don't run into that. And it's so hyper local and really depends. And I just, again, happen to be a town where people keep retiring and the customers keep coming my way too. But really kind of focusing in, I've got plenty of horse customers, but I also really try to market to people that are doing food and fiber. And my second cut customers, I love them to death. They're doing awesome stuff with sheep and goats and dairy and fiber. And actually one of my favorite ones to mention, I'll go back, is there's a draft powered vegetable farm in town that does all of their own, all of their vegetable work. It's all organic. They have a CSA. They do everything with draft horses. They used to make their own hay loose. It was beautiful. And they just kept expanding and, just doing too much. And I'm good friends with them. So we shifted to me making their hay for them off their land. And so it ends up being about 1,000 bales a year of organic hayland that they manage. They do the fertility. I come in as kind of a contractor. We figured out a per bale rate. I've got spreadsheets with like deducting the fertility and all this stuff. And they come with their teams of draft horses and grab the kicker wagons and some baling, and it's just beautiful. So there are these really cool niches in the hay game where it's, yes, the horse market can be a huge player in that, but it's just trying to build that communication and those expectations. But yeah, I try for the best quality that I can. Fertility management is a huge piece of that, and also paying attention to what species of grass are already growing. And that's the case for any of this. When you're looking at taking on hay and pasture land, we know how much things can vary. And playing that game of if you're, I'm a gaming nerd too. So it's like, if I imagine it being like a board game and each field is like a card with its various pluses and minuses. I've got some fields that grow such fine grasses. I know that if I save them till later in the rotation, not purposefully wait, but just try to marathon through first cut, which always takes me a good couple months anyway. And if I save those ones for later, the palatability and quality tends to actually still be there more compared to, say, like primarily orchard grass fields and stuff like that. But communicating that and trying not to act like all hay is hay and there's no difference, and working with customers on what they want and allowing them to try bales can be a lot of headache to work through, but also really rewarding and gets dedicated repeat business, at least in my biased experience, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I'm not even sure I know what I'm talking about. So maybe
That's great. I'm there too a lot.
I hear people like Sarah Flack when she's talking about, like leasing for a really long period of time, talking about like selling your rights to that lease, or like in like the long term kind of almost succession.
Yeah.
Could you just do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. So this idea, if you have a long-term lease where there might be a succession component of who's going to take over that land and maybe even the lease itself.
Right. And the idea of like still being able to build equity even though you
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few different creative ways to go about that. So right. So it's not just who's going to farm it next, but if you're doing improvements or other things on that for long term, how do you have equity even if it's on a lease and you don't technically own that? Yeah, there's some creative ways to do that. One that people talk about a lot is a ground lease, which is pretty complicated, and a lot of them exist. There's pluses and minuses, and maybe more than we should get into in this moment. But it's a way for the farmer to legally own the infrastructure, and the landowner to still own the land. And then when somebody else leases the land, the farmer can sell that infrastructure to the next person. It's really similar to the way that like office leases and other commercial leases are done, where the business owns the building, but somebody else owns the land. It's also really complex. It takes a very specific type of landowner to be up for it, usually a land trust or some other kind of entity like that. And there can be some downsides as far as if there isn't a successor, if nobody's interested, what happens? If the farmer's overinvested, I mean, it's a squishy thing to say, but if they've invested in the land heavily and have a lot of infrastructure to sell and no buyer, what happens? So there's other creative ways too, where you can have if a private landowner is up for it, there could be a mechanic for them to reimburse you at the end of the lease for the value of, say, a barn or a shed or something you've put up on it, or the fencing itself. It takes a particular type of landowner, somebody who's willing to be on the hook for that. He needs the capital to pay you out or to take out a loan or something like that. But there's ways to simulate that equity and be creative without technically owning it, if everybody can agree to that situation. But a lot of times it is just a matter of there's some risk in it, and then it's having the lease be long enough that you feel like you'll at least get your return on investment in that amount of time. Yeah.
How far are you traveling?
Let's see. I should know mileage on it. I know that from farthest end to farthest end is about a 45-minute tractor ride. By car is about 20 minutes, maybe averaging 30 miles an hour. I should do that math. But I am thankfully all in one town, and I don't have to trailer or anything. I have my tractors and my trusty pickup that moves the circus around. But I also do like the hop from field to field. I mean, I store my equipment at whatever the last field was and tarp the baler and all of that, and then move on to the next one rather than try to bring everything home again, which also means a lot of trust in the local community that people are going to, not mess with my stuff. But yeah, I know there's people that are going across towns or multiple towns, and that just exponentially gets more and more difficult. But yeah. Wow. Yeah. Right. Do you have a way to like trailer stuff or? Yeah. Yep. Sure. What is this for hay or for? Yeah. Are you doing rounds or? Yeah. Okay.
Well, guys currently been doing square.
Yeah.
debacle.
Yeah.
There's a demand for squares. Like
Yep.
I don't deal with squares.
Yep.
and that stuff.
Yeah, you have to have something going on up here like I do to want to deal with them.
I know I can make 100 squares.
Yeah,
Extras around for
of course.
stuff, sell whatever extra.
Totally. No, that makes sense. But yeah, it's that cost benefit analysis of moving for something like that. And yeah, I don't know why. Well, it's the bale throwers why I love squares so much. But anyway, now that I have one, it means everything. I know we're up against time and all of that.
And I'm sure that people in this
Yeah,
do have questions.
absolutely.
But thank you so much. And again, I'll just, Jay said it, but the Land for Good website has so many good resources. Check it out. I mean, like one sheet, but also just like books on just how to do this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Yep. And here's my contact information. Happy to chat with any of you. And if you're in other states and have more specific questions, I can always put you in touch with other field agents to talk to also. But yeah, I'll be around. Thanks so much for being here.